So, I want to talk about grief, which is not something I talk about often, but I think it's a good topic to cover. So, today marks 14 years since my mom died from breast cancer. And as I was mulling over the whole thing, remembering her, thinking of all, the years that have gone by so quickly, it reminded me that we need to talk about grief more because obviously people go through grief all the time. And through my own grieving process, losing my mom and of course losing other people, but obviously the loss of a mom it's monumental. I've learned a few lessons that I wanted to share. The first thing is that you will never know how it feels to lose someone you love, a mother or father especially, or a child, I presume. You will never know what that feels like until you lose someone. Because before my mom passed, I had lost uncles, aunties, things like that. And I remember when other people's, their moms would die, my friends' moms would die, or their dad would die, or whatever. And, you would go and see them and you would say, oh, I'm so sorry. And you feel sad for them. But you do not understand the gravity of what that feels like until it happens to you. So that's the first thing. And the reason I mention that is that a lot of people get offended when people come to comfort them when they're grieving and they feel like people are saying the wrong things. But a lot of the time, people don't know what the right thing to say is, especially if they've never lost anyone close to them. So I think we always have to give grace to the fact that people will come and say things. They're well intended, but if they've never experienced loss of that magnitude, then they don't have a clue. And, whatever they're saying it from a good place. And so that's very important. But the kind of things that remain with me that I've learned through the whole process is that no two people grieve the same. Now, even in a family with siblings, or, my dad, for example, grieved very differently to the way we grieved. My brother grieved differently to the way I grieved. My cousins, people have different relationships with the person that passes. So everyone's loss will be different and everyone is going to grieve in a different way. So you mustn't measure your grief with somebody else's, because sometimes we see somebody else and we think, oh, how come they've got over it so quickly? Or how come they're laughing and smiling and I'm still sad? Don't compare your grief process. The process is a long one, but it can be different for everybody, the rate at which you go through it. Some people come to certain stages quicker than others. I remember when I lost my mom, there was a lady in my office, one of my colleagues, who'd lost her mom a few months before. And she came back to work 3 days after the funeral. And I remember thinking, oh, that was very quick, but I didn't think much of it because I had not had the experience. When my mom passed, I didn't go back to work for a month. I just couldn't. I couldn't face work. I took, some time off initially. Then we had the funeral. And then I came back and I thought I should go back to work, but I really couldn't. And I felt very guilty because I kept thinking, well, that woman was able to go back to work. Why can't you go back to work? It took me a month, and I was very lucky. I had a very, very kind and compassionate manager who just said, take all the time you need. So don't compare your grief to someone else's. Everybody grieves in a different way. The other thing to understand is that, and perhaps this is actually best targeted at people that want to comfort you when you're grieving. So if you're comforting anyone who is grieving, you don't have to do anything special. I think people feel like they have to come up and say something really monumental or, impactful. But there's no need to do that, because actually most of the stuff you hear at that point in time just doesn't sit. I think what matters more is action. I remember more the people that did stuff, that went out of their way to take care of the kids, for example, to bring food, for example, to take my kids to their house so I could have time to help with the, all the programs we had. I remember those things vividly. I don't remember what anybody said to me. So don't worry so much about what should I say to this person. Worry more about, don't worry, but think more about what can I do to help, even if that means just sitting with the person. And that doesn't mean you have to have a conversation. Don't try to force them to talk. If it just means sitting with them, making them a cup of tea, just being there, that really does make a difference. The other thing that grief has taught me is empathy, because we never know what people are going through. And the reason I say that is that when you lose someone that's close to you, your life more or less stops. It feels like it stops. But the unfortunate thing at that time, what is unfortunate is that the world doesn't stop. Everything is going on as per normal. Everyone is getting up in the morning, doing what they normally do. And so that can be very destabilizing and very difficult to process, because you feel like everything is over, right? At that point in time, I can't do all the things I used to do. I can't laugh. I can't go out. I can't have fun. I'm just immersed in this grief. And yet life is going on. So one of the things that teaches is empathy, because when people are grieving, they don't write it on their faces. You don't know what's going on with them. You may not even know anything has happened. You just see a person and they seem to be miserable or sad or angry or annoyed. And we just think, oh, they're just being an asshole or whatever. So you have to remember that we don't know what people are going through. A little bit of kindness, a little bit of compassion, and just empathy always comes in handy. And the final thing I'd like to mention is that grief is not, grieving and the process of healing is not linear. There's no finite time for you to stop missing the person you've lost. There's still times, even now, as I said, 14 years later, where I have a memory or I'm going through something and I think the only person I would want is my mother. And obviously I don't have her. So that can make me feel very sad. And then there are times when I think of her and it's all happy memories and I don't feel sad. So there's no end point to feeling sad about someone you've lost. And your grief, that process of grief, can take a year for some people, can take 6 months. For some people can take 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You don't have to justify still grieving 2 years later or 3 years later. Sometimes people feel like, there's something wrong with them because they can't move on. Of course, if you're stuck in grief for a long, long time, or you feel like you're not moving on as you should, then maybe speaking to someone, seeing a therapist, a coach, a counselor might help. But the point I'm trying to make is that, you can still grieve someone 20 years after they've passed, especially when you're talking about parents, who have such an impact on your life. So don't measure, or how long is this going? People ask that. They say, how long is it going to take? Nobody knows. It's going to be different for everyone. Yeah, so, but the main thing is talk to people that you are close to friends. When you're grieving, it's important to talk about the person that you've lost. A lot of the time, people don't want to mention the person because they think they're going to upset you. But actually, talking about someone you've lost can help you. So talk to people. If you're missing them, find a good friend who will listen and talk about how you're feeling. But yeah. Those are the things I learned from grief. I hope that helps.